So, Legacy of Slavery, got more Rhetoric coming right up. What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Common Sense, Logic, and Reason. And as always, I want to say thank y'all for joining me today. So, I have more Rhetoric for y'all. Legacy of Slavery is an example of historical crime. Obviously it is, because they're crime from the standpoint of history, which took place, slavery, which took place in history, doesn't exist anymore in America. But I was watching an episode of Middle Ground, and this is a show that's hosted by Jubilee, the channel on YouTube. And if you're unfamiliar with Middle Ground is, they'll take two basically people from an opposing argument, and two groups from an opposite topic, an imposing topic, and then they'll sit down and they'll discuss it. Now, this particular episode was basically Africans versus African Americans. And the question was, did slavery affect your family? Now, as I watched the video, I heard nothing but victimhood from the African Americans, which I expected that, because this is where you hear the majority of victimhood from. You generally don't hear victimhood coming from black people from Africa, because usually, more than likely, they've seen worse than what black people in America have. And blacks in America, or FBAs, believe that they're being oppressed, but it truly, if you look at the rest of the world and you look at the condition of most people in the world, blacks in America are actually privileged. They just don't know it because they haven't seen any real oppression. But so let's talk about this legacy of slavery, because this is what you heard most of what they were saying. A lot of the black African Americans, they kept talking about this legacy of slavery. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this is this idea that, it goes back to this notion that your life experience gets imprinted in your DNA, and then you pass it off to your children, which then gets passed to their children, and then you have a legacy of that. Well, legacy of slavery is this idea that slavery has gotten imprinted into black people in America. And this slavery, is imprint of slavery in black people's DNA, is basically being handed down, and we still see the effects of all of that today. Now, the problem I have with this narrative of legacy of slavery is that there is no such thing as trauma passed down in your DNA. This is what they believe, that there's trauma from the past and it's just passed down. But truthfully, you don't pass trauma in your DNA. What you really pass is the ability to survive whatever condition that you're in. And it's not your DNA, it's actually your RNA. But if you live in an area where there's a lot of diseases going on, a lot of bacteria, your body has to fight against that, and your immune system has to basically boost itself to fight against these diseases and bacteria. What you will do is you will pass the instructions into your children in order to be able to fight the same thing that you have, and so they'll be better equipped to deal with the situation. And this is exactly what's passed on in your DNA. And this happens in all species, not just human beings. If you put rat poison down, or ant poison, or whatever, or roach poison, the next generation is going to be more immune to that, because they're going to pass the ability to survive. Again, it's a survival thing. So, again, this whole idea of legacy of slavery being passed down is ridiculous. So, the question, though, that I have for this idea notion of, the questions I have about this idea notion of, this legacy of slavery. First question I have is, when did it start for blacks in America? FBAs. Did it start in Africa when blacks were enslaved by other blacks in Africa? Yes, that took place. Blacks were enslaved, and this is something that, again, this has been going on in Africa. Blacks were enslaved by other black people. They were taken as prisoners of war. Did it start there? What about, did it start when the Africans sold the other blacks to other groups of people and put them on slave ships and transported? Did it start in the slave ships? Right? What about the Arabic slave trade, when they marched blacks across the desert? Did it start in the desert, when something like more than half the slaves didn't survive the trek across the desert from Africa to the Middle East with the Arabic slave trade, which lasted longer than the transatlantic slave trade, and more slaves were taken than in the transatlantic slave trade? Well, did the trauma exist there? Or the blacks who were transported, did it exist there? Or are you telling me that the trauma only started when these slaves got off the ship into the United States of America, then all of this trauma started happening, and all of this trauma followed us through slavery and existed after slavery ended and exists till today? This is what they're trying to tell us. Now, my second question that I have for these people who want to talk about this legacy of slavery is, what is the actual evidence of this legacy of slavery? What's the trait, the behavior? There has to be some characteristic that you have to point to that we saw amongst blacks during the days of slavery. And after slavery ended, these bad traits continue to happen. And we see these traits in black people today. What are these traits that you'll see? Because I don't see any legacy of any slavery. I mean, you look at black people today and the real problems facing black people: single parent households, homes without fathers, high murder rates, high crime rates in the black community, right? And all that is basically spawned by the lack of fathers, these single parent households run by women, mothers. You look at the real problem facing black people in America is right there. And this problem didn't exist after slavery. Matter of fact, none of these problems existed until after the Great Society. There was no high crime rates amongst black people until after the Great Society destroyed the black family or eroded the black family. There was no high crime rates amongst black people. Okay, the crime rates among black people were low. Black people weren't killing and shooting each other prior to that. Again, prior to the Great Society, the marriage rates of black people were in the 80-some%. Now it's, I would say that the latest stat I heard is 1 out of 4 black women will ever get married, SBAs in America. That wasn't the case back then until the Great Society. Again, look at the out of wedlock births of black people. Prior to that, the out of wedlock birth rates of black people were in the high teens, low 20s. Now it's 75%. And I guarantee you, it's in the 90% when you get in the hood. 90+% in the hood. So none of these problems existed until the Great Society. So actually, there is no legacy of slavery. It's a legacy of the Great Society. There's nothing that black people can say, hey, look at this. This is a result of slavery. None of this is a legacy of slavery. So what is the real legacy of slavery, then, you may ask? Well, the real legacy of slavery that's facing black people in America, that black people suffer from, is the concept of brainwashing the next generation to believe that they're victims. Black people will often say, when concerning quote-unquote white supremacists and the KKK and neo-Nazis and all this, they'll constantly say that hate is not something that you're born with. Hate is something that you're taught. Well, the same thing goes with victimhood. Nobody's born a victim. They're taught a victim. There's nothing in your DNA when you're born that says you're a victim. Black people are taught victims, and this is the big lie narrative again. From the time that when these kids are born, these black children are born, from the typical FBA black person in America, from the time they're born, right, to the time that they're turn 18 and become an adult, they've been brainwashed with this narrative that white supremacy, white man out to get us, systemic racism, so on and so forth, police brutality, and there's no evidence of none of this, but they've been so brainwashed and programmed with this all of their lives that, the big lie narrative, if you tell the lie big enough, long enough, and loud enough, eventually people accept the lie as true. And this whole idea of a legacy of slavery is just a lie that blacks have told other blacks. There is no legacy of slavery. There's more of a legacy of the Great Society than anything. But the only legacy of slavery is a legacy of brainwashing and programming the next generation of black people to be victims. And at the end of the day, that's all it is. There's no trauma passed on to black people from the slavery, especially from a people who've never seen slavery, who've never really been oppressed. And oppression is, again, is just another thing that they've been brainwashing programmed with. So there is no legacy of slavery. There is no tie to slavery. None of the problems or behaviors that you see persisting in black people today has no link to slavery. Slavery has no impact upon black people in America, FBAs, other than the fact that your ancestor from Africa sold you into slavery to white people who transported you here here in America, as opposed to in South America, where the majority of the slaves in the transatlantic slave trade went to. So the real legacy is a legacy of brainwashing. Now, the question I have for black people: how long are we going to continue to brainwash the next generation into being victims? Wouldn't it be best to not teach them that they're victims and tell them that they're victims, so that they won't be, quote unquote, irreparably harmed and they'll be able to function in society like civilized human beings? I mean, you know, there's a saying that those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. Well, I would rather not teach my children a history if it's going to cause them this much harm that they can't function in society. So we are brainwashing our children. So again, it's no legacy of slavery, it's a legacy of brainwashing. How long are we going to keep going on with black people, FBAs? How long are we going to continue going on with brainwashing the next generation as being victims of something that they never experienced and never seen? Anyway, y'all, if you ever hear any black person cry about the legacy of slavery, well, now you know, and knowing it's half the battle, and it's always, always, always y'all. Until next time.